I'm writing this because I need people to understand what happened before I do what I'm about to do. My phone has 47 missed calls from my mother Bernadette, 39 from my father Nicholas, and 23 from my sister Emma. They've been blowing up my phone since Friday morning and it's only Monday afternoon. I haven't answered a single one, and I'm not going to. Let me back up to last Thursday, my 26th birthday. My parents insisted on throwing me a big family dinner at their house. They said it would be nice to have everyone together since we hadn't done a large gathering in a while. I should have known something was wrong when my mom specifically told me to arrive at 6 p.m. sharp and to dress nicely. She kept emphasizing that this was important and that I needed to be there on time. I showed up at 5:55 p.m. There were cars everywhere. I counted at least 15 vehicles in the driveway and along the street. When I walked in, the living room and dining room were packed with relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my grandmother, family friends I hadn't seen in years. Someone had set up a long table with food. Everyone was dressed up. It looked like a wedding reception. My sister Emma was standing near the entrance with this weird smile on her face. She told me to come into the dining room because Mom and Dad wanted to make an announcement. I figured they were going to do some embarrassing birthday toast or show old baby photos or something. Standard parent stuff. Nicholas stood up at the head of the table and clinked his glass. Everyone got quiet. He started talking about how they'd raised me for 26 years, how they'd sacrificed everything, how they'd given me every opportunity. His tone was off. It wasn't warm or celebratory. It was cold and formal, like he was reading from a prepared statement. Then Bernadette stood up. She walked over to the wall where they had family photos displayed. She grabbed my high school graduation photo, ripped it off the wall, and threw it in the trash can they'd positioned nearby. Then she took down another photo of me, and another. Each time she threw one away, she'd say something. You were always ungrateful. You never appreciated what we gave you. You're a failure who drained us dry. The room was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. My grandmother had her hand over her mouth. My cousin was recording on his phone. I just stood there trying to process what was happening. Nicholas pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me. Inside was a printed document. At the top it said, "Invoice for parenting services rendered," and listed out every expense they claimed to have spent raising me. Diapers, formula, clothing, school supplies, car insurance, college tuition, line items going back 26 years. The total at the bottom was $114,000. He told me this was every cent they'd wasted raising an ungrateful son who never amounted to anything. He said I had two options: pay them back in full or never contact them again. He said they were done being my parents. I was officially cut off from the family. Emma stepped forward and held out her hand. She told me to give her my car keys. I was confused until Nicholas explained that the car I'd been driving was technically still in his name. He'd been letting me use it, but now he was transferring the title to Emma. She needed a better vehicle anyway. Emma took the keys right out of my hand and dropped them in her purse. That's when I noticed Ryan sitting at the far end of the table, my boss, from my job. He was there at my parents' birthday dinner for me. Bernadette gestured to him and said they'd invited him so he could hear the truth about what kind of person I really was. Ryan stood up and told me he'd had a long conversation with my parents earlier that week. They'd explained some concerning things about my character and work ethic. He said based on their input and his own observations, he was terminating my employment effective immediately. I should clear out my desk Monday morning. I need you to understand something. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't ask why or beg them to reconsider. I looked at that room full of relatives and family friends who'd come to witness my humiliation. I looked at my parents and my sister and my former boss, and I turned around and walked out. I called an Uber from the sidewalk. I went back to my apartment, and I started making plans. See, here's what my parents didn't know. I'd been preparing for something like this for 3 years. Not exactly this scenario, but I'd known for a long time that our relationship was deteriorating. They'd been making comments for years about how I was a disappointment, how I wasn't living up to their expectations, how I owed them for everything they'd done. The intensity had been escalating since I'd started making my own decisions about my life instead of following their prescribed path. My father wanted me to go to medical school. I went into tech support instead. My mother wanted me involved in her church activities and social groups. I stopped attending after college. They wanted me to date Emma's friends and join their country club. I did neither. Every choice I made that diverged from their vision created more resentment. The thing is, my parents are all about image, status, what the family thinks, what their friends think. They needed everyone to see them as perfect parents with perfect children living perfect lives. I wasn't cooperating with that narrative anymore, so they decided to publicly eject me from it. What they didn't count on was that I'm actually good at my job. Very good. Ryan firing me was a problem that would solve itself once I contacted his regional manager, who I'd worked with directly on several major accounts. Ryan had no actual grounds for termination, and my parents certainly couldn't provide any legitimate performance concerns. The car was annoying but not devastating. It was a 2015 sedan with 130,000 miles that needed new brakes. Emma could have it. The $114,000 bill was legally meaningless. Parents can't invoice their children for raising them. That document had zero enforceability. It was purely theatrical. What my parents didn't realize was that their theatrical production had witnesses. 30-plus witnesses who'd watched them humiliate their son on his birthday. Some of those witnesses had their own complicated relationships with Nicholas and Bernadette. Some of them had questions about where certain family money had gone over the years. Some of them remembered things my parents probably wished they'd forgotten. I spent Thursday night making a list. I spent Friday researching. By Saturday, I had phone numbers and email addresses. By Sunday, I'd drafted several carefully worded messages. Friday morning, my phone started ringing. Bernadette first, then Nicholas, then Emma. I let every call go to voicemail. The first few messages were angry. How dare I walk out without saying anything? How dare I embarrass them in front of the family? Did I think I could just ignore them? By Friday afternoon, the tone shifted. They needed to talk to me. It was important. There were things they needed to explain. Could I please just answer the phone? Saturday, the calls got desperate. Bernadette left a voicemail saying there had been some misunderstandings at the dinner. Things had gotten out of hand. They hadn't meant for it to go that way. She wanted to meet for coffee to clear the air. Sunday morning, Nicholas left a message saying they'd made some mistakes in how they handled things. He wanted to discuss everything calmly and figure out a path forward, as a family. Sunday evening, Emma sent me 12 text messages in a row. Mom and Dad were freaking out. Relatives were calling them asking questions. Some people were saying awful things. Grandma was upset. I needed to call them back right now and tell everyone that I was fine and that we were working things out. I didn't respond to any of it. Because here's what was happening. Those carefully worded messages I'd sent out on Sunday morning were making their way through the family network. Certain relatives were having certain conversations. Questions were being asked about financial decisions Nicholas had made over the years. Questions about why Bernadette's mother's estate had been distributed the way it was. Questions about what really happened with Emma's college fund. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't making anything up. I was simply making sure the right people knew to ask the right questions about things that had actually happened. Things my parents had very carefully kept quiet. Things they'd hidden behind their perfect family image. The calls kept coming. 47, 39, 23. I have them all saved. Every voicemail where the panic escalates. Every text message where Emma tries different tactics to get me to respond. They want to talk. They want to explain. They want me to make it stop. I'm not going to make it stop. I'm going to make it worse. Update 1. It's been 8 days since the birthday dinner, and I need to update because this situation has gone completely sideways in ways I didn't anticipate. The calls haven't stopped. I'm now at 89 missed calls from Bernadette, 71 from Nicholas, and 46 from Emma. But that's not even the interesting part anymore. Let me explain what those messages I sent actually were. I didn't make anything up or spread lies. What I did was reach out to specific relatives with specific questions about specific events that had happened over the years, events that my parents had carefully controlled the narrative around. My uncle Tristan, Nicholas's younger brother, got a message asking if he'd ever received the $15,000 that Grandma Eleanor had left him in her will. According to the will I'd seen at Grandma's house years ago when I was helping her organize documents, Tristan was supposed to get that money. I'd always wondered why he never mentioned it. My Aunt Carol, Bernadette's sister, got a message asking what had happened to the proceeds from selling their mother's house after she passed. Their mother had lived in that house for 40 years. It sold for $290,000. Carol had mentioned once at Thanksgiving that she'd never seen any of that money. My cousin Ryan, different Ryan from my boss, this is Tristan's son, got a message asking if he knew what happened to the college fund that our grandmother had set up for all the grandchildren. She'd established it back in 2005 with explicit instructions that each grandchild would get an equal share when they turned 18. I didn't tell anyone what to do with this information. I just asked questions. Questions that got people thinking about things they'd been too polite or too conflict-averse to push on before. Monday morning, I dealt with a job situation. I called the regional manager, a guy named Marcus who I'd worked with directly on the software migration project last year. I explained that Ryan had terminated me on Friday without cause and without following proper procedures. Marcus was confused because he hadn't been notified of any termination. When I told him Ryan had made the decision based on a conversation with my parents at a family dinner, he went quiet for a long minute. Then he told me to sit tight and he'd call me back. 2 hours later, Marcus called back. Ryan had been suspended pending an investigation into improper termination practices. I was being reinstated with back pay for the days I'd missed. Marcus apologized for what had happened and said he'd be checking in with me personally to make sure there were no retaliation issues going forward. So I had my job back. That was one problem solved. The car situation was more annoying. I looked into my options and realized that since Nicholas had technically owned the vehicle and voluntarily transferred it to Emma, I had no legal recourse to get it back. It didn't matter that I'd been making the insurance payments and maintenance costs. His name was on the title. I started taking the bus to work and looking at used car listings online. Wednesday afternoon, my uncle Tristan called me. Not texted. Actually called. I answered because Tristan had always been decent to me and I was curious what he wanted. He got straight to the point. He'd been going through old documents after I'd sent that message, and he'd found the original copy of Grandma Eleanor's will. He'd never received the $15,000. Nicholas had been the executor of the estate. Tristan had asked about it at the time, and Nicholas had told him the estate didn't have enough liquid assets after paying debts and funeral costs. But Tristan had just requested the estate filing documents from the county clerk's office. The estate had cleared $47,000 after all debts and expenses. Nicholas had filed a document stating that the full amount went to funeral costs and estate administration fees. Tristan wanted to know if I knew anything about that. I told him I didn't know the specifics, but I knew that Nicholas had paid off his truck around that same time and had taken Bernadette on an expensive cruise. Tristan went very quiet. Then he told me he was going to be having a conversation with Nicholas and he wanted me to know that he appreciated me asking the question. Thursday morning, Emma showed up at my apartment. I have no idea how she got my address since I'd moved to this place 6 months ago and hadn't given it to any family members. She must have followed me from work or asked someone. She was standing in the hallway when I left for my bus route. She looked terrible. Her eyes were red, and she had that frantic energy people get when they haven't been sleeping. She started talking immediately. Mom and Dad were going insane. Family members were calling them constantly. Uncle Tristan had shown up at the house on Tuesday night with a copy of Grandma's will, and there had been a huge fight. Aunt Carol had hired someone to look into the house sale. Cousin Ryan had contacted a lawyer about the college fund. Everyone was turning on them, and it was my fault. I asked Emma why she thought I was responsible for Nicholas and Bernadette's decisions. She said I'd stirred everything up on purpose. I'd sent those messages to cause problems. I was trying to destroy the family because I was angry about the birthday dinner. I told her that I'd simply asked questions about things that actually happened. If those questions were causing problems, maybe she should wonder why. Emma switched tactics. She said the birthday dinner had been Dad's idea, not Mom's. She said Mom had tried to talk him out of it, but he'd been fixated on teaching me a lesson. She said they'd both been drinking before the dinner started and things had gotten out of hand. She said I needed to understand that they were under a lot of stress and I hadn't been making things easy for them. I asked her what stress I'd been causing. She got vague. Just the usual stuff. The way I'd been pulling away from the family. The way I never came to events anymore. The way I'd refused to date her friend Melissa when they'd tried to set us up. The way I'd chosen a regular job instead of pursuing something more ambitious like they'd wanted. None of that explained the birthday dinner. None of that explained the public humiliation. None of that explained trying to get me fired from my job. Emma kept talking in circles, trying to make it sound like everyone had made mistakes and we should all just move past it. I asked her about the car keys. She looked uncomfortable. She said Dad had told her I wasn't using the car properly and that she needed a vehicle for her new job. I asked her what new job. She didn't have an answer for that. She'd been working part-time at a boutique for the past year. Nothing had changed. I asked her if she'd known about the dinner beforehand, if she'd known what they were planning. She hesitated too long before saying no. That hesitation told me everything. She'd known. Maybe not all the details, but she'd known something was going to happen. Emma tried again. She said I needed to call Mom and Dad. She said I needed to tell Uncle Tristan and Aunt Carol and everyone else to stop asking questions. She said the family was falling apart and I was the only one who could fix it. I asked her why I would want to fix it. She didn't have an answer for that either. Friday afternoon, Bernadette showed up at my workplace. I was in the break room when Marcus came to find me and told me there was someone in the lobby asking for me. I went down and there was my mother, sitting in one of the visitor chairs like she was there for a business meeting. She was dressed up, hair perfect, makeup perfect, full Bernadette armor. She told me we needed to talk privately. I told her we could talk right there in the lobby. She looked around at the receptionist and the security guard and the other people walking through. She said this was family business and it needed to be private. I told her she'd made our family business public when she invited 30 relatives to watch her throw my photos in the trash. If she wanted to talk to me now, she could do it here. Bernadette's composure cracked slightly. She said I was being unreasonable and childish. She said she'd come here to apologize and try to work things out, but I was making it impossible. I asked her what she was apologizing for specifically. She started listing things in this performative way. She was sorry the dinner had gotten emotional. She was sorry things had been said in anger. She was sorry I'd felt hurt by what happened. I stopped her. I asked her if she was sorry for ripping my photos off the wall. She said that was part of what had gotten too emotional. I asked if she was sorry for calling me worthless and saying I'd drained them dry. She said she'd been upset and hadn't meant it that way. I asked if she was sorry for inviting my boss so he could fire me. She said that had been Nicholas's idea and she'd told him it was too much. Every answer was deflection. Every apology came with an excuse or an explanation or a way to shift responsibility. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said she wanted me to forgive them so they could move forward as a family. She said she wanted me to stop whatever I was doing that was making relatives ask all these questions. She said she wanted things to go back to normal. I told her there was no normal to go back to. She'd destroyed that at the birthday dinner. She said I was overreacting to one bad night. I asked her if she really thought this was about one bad night or if maybe it was about 26 years of them treating me like a disappointment because I didn't live the exact life they'd planned for me. Bernadette stood up. She said she'd tried to be reasonable. She'd tried to apologize, but I was determined to be difficult and vindictive. She said I was going to regret this when I realized I'd destroyed my own family over hurt feelings. Then she walked out of the lobby. Marcus had watched the whole thing from the second-floor hallway. He came down afterward and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. He said if she showed up again, building security would handle it. He also mentioned that he'd filed a formal complaint about Ryan's conduct and there would be a proper review process. Saturday, my phone rang 63 times. Sunday, it rang 41 times. I haven't answered any of them, but I've listened to the voicemails. They're getting more frantic and more angry at the same time. Nicholas left one message where he said I was tearing apart everything he'd built. Bernadette left one where she said I was being manipulative and cruel. Emma left one where she was crying and saying I was ruining her life too because now everyone was questioning her about things she didn't even know about. The thing is, I haven't done anything except ask questions about facts, about real things that really happened. If those facts are causing problems for Nicholas and Bernadette, that's not my manipulation. That's consequences. And this is just the beginning, because I have more questions lined up, questions about other family events, other financial decisions, other times when my parents' version of events didn't quite match reality. I've got years of observations stored up and I've been quiet about all of it because I wanted to keep the peace. I'm done keeping the peace. Update 2. It's been 17 days since the birthday dinner and the situation has exploded in ways that are honestly satisfying to watch. I'm writing this from a parking lot outside a grocery store because I needed to get out of my apartment for a while and think through what just happened. The missed calls have slowed down. I'm at 127 from Bernadette, 103 from Nicholas, and 68 from Emma. But that's because they've moved on to different tactics. Yesterday, there was a family meeting at my grandmother's house. I wasn't invited, but I heard about every detail from 3 different sources within an hour of it ending. Let me back up to what's been happening since my last update. Uncle Tristan filed a formal complaint with the probate court about Grandma Eleanor's estate. He submitted the original will and the county records showing the estate had $47,000 in liquid assets. He's demanding a full accounting of where that money went and why he never received his inheritance. Nicholas is now required to produce documentation or face legal consequences for mishandling the estate. Aunt Carol hired someone to look into her mother's house sale. Turns out Bernadette had been listed as the co-executor of that estate too. The house sold for $290,000. After the mortgage payoff and estate costs, there should have been $180,000 to split between Carol and Bernadette equally. Carol received $30,000. Bernadette told her that was her full half after all the additional costs and fees. Carol's investigator found documentation showing the full $180,000 was dispersed, with $150,000 going to an account in Bernadette's name. My cousin Ryan contacted the bank that had held Grandma Eleanor's college fund trust. The trust had been established in 2005 with $50,000 and explicit instructions that it would be divided equally among all 5 grandchildren when each turned 18. Nicholas had been named as the trustee. Ryan turned 18 in 2015. He never received any money. When he asked Nicholas about it back then, Nicholas told him the fund had underperformed and been depleted by market losses and management fees. The bank provided Ryan with the full trust history. The fund had actually grown to $73,000 by 2015. There were 5 withdrawals between 2015 and 2020, each one coinciding with a grandchild's 18th birthday. Each withdrawal was for the full amount in the account at that time. All 5 withdrawals went to an account owned by Nicholas and Bernadette. So now there are 3 separate situations where my parents were in charge of family money, and that money disappeared. I didn't make any of this happen. I just asked the questions that got people looking at records they should have looked at years ago. Tuesday afternoon, Emma showed up at my apartment again. This time she brought someone with her, a guy I didn't recognize, tall and wearing an expensive suit. Emma introduced him as her lawyer friend who was here to help us work things out. I asked Emma why we needed a lawyer to talk. She said things had gotten complicated, and someone neutral needed to mediate before everything got worse. The lawyer, whose name I immediately forgot, started talking about family reconciliation and how litigation between family members never ends well for anyone. He said he'd reviewed the situation, and there were clearly some misunderstandings that could be cleared up through honest communication. He suggested we all sit down together, parents and children, and discuss everything calmly with him present to keep things productive. I asked him who was paying him. He said he was doing this as a favor to Emma. I asked Emma how she'd met this lawyer. She got vague again. He was someone she'd met through friends. He'd offered to help when he'd heard about our family issues. I asked him directly who had actually contacted him first. He said Emma had reached out, but that Bernadette had provided him with background information about the situation. So my mother had gotten Emma to bring a lawyer to my apartment to try to convince me to sit down for a mediated conversation. I told him I wasn't interested. The lawyer said I was making a mistake. He said families who let conflicts escalate into legal battles often destroy relationships permanently. I told him the relationships were already destroyed, and that happened at a birthday dinner 17 days ago. Emma started crying. Real tears this time, not the performative kind. She said I was ruining everything. She said Mom and Dad were falling apart. She said Uncle Tristan wasn't speaking to them. She said Aunt Carol had screamed at Mom over the phone for 20 minutes. She said the whole family was choosing sides and she was stuck in the middle. She said I needed to fix this because I was the one who'd started it. I asked Emma if she'd known about any of the missing money, the inheritance that Tristan never got, the house sale proceeds that Carol never saw, the college fund that disappeared. She said she didn't know anything about any of that. I asked her if she believed Mom and Dad had legitimate explanations for where all that money went. She said there had to be explanations. She said Mom and Dad weren't thieves. She said there were probably just misunderstandings and paperwork errors. I asked her if she really believed that or if she was just trying to convince herself. She didn't answer. The lawyer tried to jump back in with more mediation talk. I told them both to leave. Emma kept crying. The lawyer left his business card on my kitchen counter. They left. Wednesday, I got a text from my grandmother. Not a call, a text, which was unusual because she's 81 and barely knows how to use her phone. The text said she wanted to see me. She said the family was meeting at her house on Saturday afternoon and I needed to be there. She said it was important and she wasn't asking. I texted back asking if Nicholas and Bernadette would be there. She said everyone would be there. I asked if this was an ambush. She said it was a family meeting to address serious issues and my presence was required. I told her I'd think about it. Thursday, Bernadette called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I thought it might be work-related. She started talking immediately. She said I'd won. She said I'd successfully turned the family against them. She said I'd destroyed their reputation and their relationships with everyone they cared about. She said I must be very proud of myself. I asked her if she was calling to blame me for the consequences of her own actions. She said I'd manipulated the situation to make them look bad. She said I'd asked questions in a way that made people suspicious when there were perfectly reasonable explanations for everything. I asked her what the reasonable explanation was for keeping Tristan's $15,000 inheritance. She said the estate had debts I didn't know about. I asked her what the reasonable explanation was for keeping $120,000 of Carol's house sale money. She said there had been additional estate expenses that Carol didn't understand. I asked her why she'd never explained these expenses to Tristan and Carol before, why she'd let them believe they'd received their full inheritances. She said it was complicated, and I wouldn't understand because I'd never been responsible for managing family estates. I told her she was right that I didn't understand how someone could steal from their own family members and sleep at night. Bernadette's tone shifted completely. She said I had no idea what I was talking about. She said she and Nicholas had sacrificed everything for this family. She said they'd put everyone else first for decades. She said if they'd used some of that money for their own needs, they'd earned it through years of taking care of everyone else's problems. I asked her if Tristan and Carol knew they'd earned the right to take money that wasn't theirs. She hung up. Friday morning, Nicholas called from the same unknown number. He tried a different approach. He said he knew I was angry about the birthday dinner. He said he'd handled things poorly, and he regretted the way he'd approached the situation. He said he'd been trying to teach me a lesson about responsibility and gratitude, but he'd gone too far. He said he wanted to make things right. I asked him what making things right looked like. He said we could sit down as a family and talk through everything. He said we could work out the issues with Tristan and Carol and Ryan. He said there were explanations for the financial questions people were raising, and he wanted a chance to explain them properly. He said if I came to the family meeting on Saturday, he'd answer any questions I had and we could start rebuilding trust. I asked him if he'd be writing Tristan a check for $15,000. He said it wasn't that simple. I asked him if he'd be writing Carol a check for $120,000. He said the estate situations were legally complex and required proper documentation and review. I asked him if he'd be returning the money from the college fund that was supposed to go to 5 grandchildren. He said that money had been used for family expenses over the years, and there was no pool of cash sitting somewhere to return. So basically, he wanted me to come to a family meeting where he'd explain why he was justified in keeping money that belonged to other people. I told him I wasn't interested in his explanations. He said I owed him the chance to defend himself. I told him he'd had 17 days to defend himself, and instead, he'd spent that time calling me 103 times and sending Emma with a lawyer to pressure me. He said I was being unreasonable and vindictive. I hung up. Saturday morning, I got 6 more texts from Emma. She was begging me to come to Grandma's house. She said everyone would be there and this was my chance to hear Mom and Dad's side of things. She said if I didn't come, I was proving that I didn't actually care about the truth and just wanted to cause problems. She said Grandma was upset that I was refusing to attend. She said I was making everything worse by staying away. I didn't go to the family meeting. Instead, I sat in my apartment and waited for the updates I knew would come. At 3:47 p.m., I got a text from Cousin Ryan. The meeting had been a disaster. Nicholas and Bernadette had tried to explain the financial situations but couldn't produce any actual documentation to support their claims. Uncle Tristan had brought his lawyer. Aunt Carol had brought her investigator's report. They'd confronted Nicholas and Bernadette with specific numbers and dates and demands for accountability. According to Ryan, Nicholas had started yelling that everyone was ganging up on them over misunderstandings. Bernadette had cried and said they'd given their whole lives to this family and this was how they were being repaid. Emma had defended them and said everyone was being unfair. Grandma had tried to keep order but eventually gave up. Tristan and Carol had both said they were pursuing legal action. Nicholas had said if that's what they wanted, he'd fight them in court. Everyone had left angry. At 4:15 p.m., I got a voice message from Grandma. She said she was disappointed I hadn't come to the meeting. She said families need to face problems together, not run away from them. She said I'd started this situation and I had a responsibility to see it through. She said she didn't know what I thought I was accomplishing, but I was tearing the family apart. I sat there in my apartment and listened to that message 3 times. My grandmother, who I'd always loved and respected, was blaming me for tearing the family apart, not Nicholas for taking money that wasn't his, not Bernadette for lying about estate distributions, not the two of them for publicly humiliating me at a birthday dinner, me for asking questions about where money went. That's when I realized they'd gotten to her too. They'd convinced her that the real problem wasn't what they'd done, but the fact that I'd exposed it. And if they'd convinced her, they were probably trying to convince everyone else the same way. I'm not backing down. This meeting wasn't the end. It was just confirmation that Nicholas and Bernadette have no intention of taking actual responsibility for what they've done. They want to manage the narrative and make themselves the victims. But I've got more moves to make, because here's what they don't know yet. I've been collecting receipts of my own, documentation of every time they've lied about me to other people, every time they've twisted situations to make themselves look good, every time they've used family relationships to manipulate and control people, and I'm about to start sharing that documentation. Final update. It's been 29 days since the birthday dinner. This is probably my last update because the situation has reached a point where there's not much left to say. Nicholas and Bernadette are facing consequences they can't talk or manipulate their way out of. Emma has finally had to accept some uncomfortable truths, and I'm exactly where I plan to be. The week after the failed family meeting, things accelerated. Uncle Tristan filed a formal petition with the probate court demanding a full investigation into how Grandma Eleanor's estate was handled. Aunt Carol filed a civil suit against Bernadette for the missing $120,000 from their mother's house sale. Cousin Ryan and the other grandchildren retained a lawyer to pursue recovery of the college fund money. My parents hired their own lawyer, an expensive one based on what Emma told me when she showed up at my apartment for the 3rd time. She was frantic. She said Mom and Dad were drowning in legal fees. She said they were going to have to sell the house to pay for their defense. She said this was all spiraling out of control, and I was the only one who could stop it by telling everyone to drop their cases. I asked Emma why she thought I had that power. She said because everyone knew I'd started this. She said if I publicly said I'd been wrong to raise questions and that I believed Mom and Dad had reasonable explanations, then the family would back off. I asked her if she actually believed Mom and Dad had reasonable explanations for taking money that belonged to other people. She said there had to be explanations we didn't understand. I told Emma I was done protecting her from reality. I pulled out my phone and showed her something I'd been holding onto. Screenshots of text conversations between Bernadette and Emma from 2 months before the birthday dinner. Messages where Bernadette was complaining about me, saying I was an embarrassment to the family, saying I needed to be taught a lesson about respect and gratitude, saying she and Nicholas were planning something that would put me in my place. Emma's face went white. She said she didn't remember those conversations. I scrolled through more messages. Ones where Emma agreed that I'd been difficult. Ones where she said maybe a wake-up call would be good for me. Ones where she asked what mom and dad were planning, and Bernadette said it would be a birthday I'd never forget. I asked Emma if she still wanted to claim she didn't know anything about the birthday dinner beforehand. She started crying again. She said she hadn't known the specific details. She said she'd thought they were just going to have a serious conversation with me in front of the family. She said she hadn't known about the photos or the invoice or getting me fired. She said when it happened, she'd been shocked too, but she didn't know what to do. I asked her why she took the car keys. She said Dad had told her to. She said he'd said the car was his property and I didn't deserve it anymore. She said she'd felt weird about it, but she'd done what he asked because he was her father. I asked her if she felt weird about driving my car around while I took the bus to work. She didn't answer. I showed her more screenshots. These ones were from my own years of observation. Messages I'd saved where Bernadette had lied to relatives about why I wasn't at family events. Emails where Nicholas had told extended family I was struggling financially and couldn't be relied on when actually I'd been doing fine. Text chains where they'd trash-talk me to other family members for not following their life plan. Emma asked why I'd kept all of this. I told her I'd been keeping records for 3 years because I'd known eventually they'd go too far and I'd need proof that this wasn't sudden or one-sided. The birthday dinner had just been the catalyst. The evidence of them being manipulative and controlling went back years. Emma asked what I wanted from her. I told her I didn't want anything from her. She'd made her choice to side with them. She'd known something was planned and she'd participated. She'd taken my car. She'd brought a lawyer to my apartment to pressure me. She'd spent a month trying to convince me I was the problem. I was done with her too. She left and I haven't heard from her since. That was 11 days ago. Last Tuesday, Nicholas showed up at my apartment building. He didn't come to my door. He waited outside on the sidewalk. When I left for work in the morning, he was standing there. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His clothes looked slept in. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 4 weeks. He started talking immediately. He said we needed to have a real conversation, just the two of us, without lawyers or other family members or anyone else interfering. He said there were things I needed to understand about the family finances and the decisions he'd made over the year. He said everything he'd done had been for good reasons that I was too young to understand. I told him I was 26 years old and I understood perfectly well that he'd stolen from his brother and his wife's sister and his own grandchildren. He said it wasn't theft. He said he'd been managing family resources. He said when you're responsible for multiple estates and trust funds, sometimes you have to make decisions about where money is most needed. He said the money had gone to important family expenses. I asked him what important family expenses required $15,000 from Tristan's inheritance. He said they'd had significant debt at that time, and if they'd lost their house, the whole family would have suffered. I asked him why he didn't explain that to Tristan and asked to borrow the money. He said Tristan wouldn't have understood the urgency and there wasn't time for negotiations. I asked him about the $120,000 from Carol's house sale. He said Bernadette's sister had never been good with money and they'd been concerned she'd waste her inheritance. He said they'd planned to give her the money over time in manageable amounts, but then Carol had stopped speaking to Bernadette over some family argument and the situation had become complicated. I asked him about the college fund. He said that money had been used for family emergencies over the years when no other options were available. He said they'd always planned to repay it before the grandchildren turned 18, but then the financial situation had become more difficult than expected. He said they'd been working on a plan to restore the fund when all of this blew up. Every answer was a rationalization. Every theft was reframed as responsible financial management. Every lie was justified as protecting someone from themselves or preventing a worse outcome. I asked him if he really believed what he was saying or if he'd just told himself these stories so many times he'd convinced himself they were true. Nicholas got angry. He said I had no idea what it was like to be responsible for a family. He said I'd spent 26 years taking from them and contributing nothing. He said I'd gone to college on their money and lived in their house and driven their car, and never once thanked them properly. He said when they'd tried to teach me a lesson about gratitude, I'd turned vindictive and destroyed everything out of spite. I told him the birthday dinner wasn't a lesson. It was a humiliation. It was a public execution designed to punish me for not being the son he wanted. I asked him why he'd invited my boss. He said they'd needed to show me there were real consequences for disrespecting your parents. I asked him why he'd handed me a fake invoice. He said he'd wanted me to understand exactly how much I owed them. I asked him if he understood that everything happening now was the direct result of his own actions. The lawsuits, the legal fees, the destroyed family relationships. All of it came from him deciding to steal money from family members and then publicly humiliate his son when that son didn't live up to his expectations. Nicholas said I could stop all of it. He said if I talked to Tristan and Carol and told them I'd misunderstood the financial situations, they'd listen to me. He said if I admitted I'd been angry and vindictive and had stirred up trouble on purpose, the family would forgive everyone and move forward. He said I had the power to fix this, and I was choosing not to because I wanted to see them suffer. I told him he was right that I wanted to see them suffer. I'd spent years watching them manipulate and control people, years watching them present this perfect family image while treating me like a disappointing investment that hadn't paid off, years knowing they were lying about financial situations but not having enough information to prove it. The birthday dinner had been my breaking point, and yes, I deliberately asked questions that would expose what they'd been hiding. Nicholas said I was just like them then, manipulative and vindictive. I told him maybe I'd learned from the best. He said this would destroy them. They'd lose the house. They'd lose their standing in the family. They'd lose everything they'd built. I told him they'd built it on lies and stolen money, so maybe they deserved to lose it. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said I was dead to him. He said I'd made my choice and now I'd have to live with having no family. He said when I was older and alone and realized what I'd thrown away, it would be too late. I told him I'd been dead to them at the birthday dinner when Bernadette threw my photos in the trash. This was just making it official. He walked away. That was 8 days ago. Yesterday, Bernadette tried one more time. She called from yet another unknown number. When I answered, she didn't yell or cry or blame. She just sounded tired. She said they were putting the house on the market. The legal fees were too much and they needed to settle with Tristan and Carol to avoid going to court. She said they'd be moving into a small apartment. She said Emma was devastated because she'd grown up in that house. I asked Bernadette why she was telling me this. She said she wanted me to know what I'd accomplished. She said I'd set out to destroy them, and I'd succeeded. She said I should be proud. I asked her if she'd ever considered just being honest with people. She said honesty was a luxury for people who didn't have real responsibilities. I asked her if she regretted the birthday dinner. She said she regretted that I'd turned out to be the kind of person who would destroy his own family over hurt feelings. I asked her if she regretted stealing from family members. She said she regretted trusting family members with financial information they weren't sophisticated enough to understand. I asked her if there was any scenario where she'd admit she and Nicholas had done wrong things. She said they'd made difficult decisions that people with limited perspective couldn't appreciate. I told her that was my answer then. We were done. She said we'd been done the night I walked out of the birthday dinner without even trying to understand their perspective. I hung up. That was yesterday morning. Cousin Ryan texted me last night with an update. Nicholas and Bernadette have agreed to settle. They're paying Tristan $30,000, which is his original inheritance plus interest. They're paying Carol $150,000, which is what she should have received, plus some additional amount that was negotiated. They're paying $45,000 total to the 5 grandchildren to settle the college fund situation. The house sale is going through next month. After they pay the settlements and their legal fees, they'll have enough left for a small apartment and maybe a year of living expenses. Emma has been posting on social media about how cruel and heartless people can be, about how families should forgive and support each other, about how holding grudges destroys lives. She hasn't mentioned me by name, but everyone knows what she's talking about. She's getting sympathetic comments from family friends who don't know the full story. My grandmother hasn't contacted me since that one voicemail. Uncle Tristan sent me a message thanking me for asking the question that led to him finally getting his inheritance. Aunt Carol sent one saying she'd always suspected Bernadette had kept more of the house money, but she'd never had the courage to push for an investigation. Cousin Ryan said the grandchildren were splitting their settlement and using it for actual education expenses like Grandma Eleanor had intended. I'm writing this from the same apartment I've been living in for 6 months, the apartment my parents never had the address to until Emma found it somehow. I took the bus to work this morning. I'll take it home tonight. I've been looking at used cars, but I'm not in a rush. My job is secure. Marcus checked in with me last week and confirmed that Ryan is no longer with the company. There was a formal finding that he'd violated termination procedures and showed bias in personnel decisions. I bought myself a birthday cake 2 days ago, just a small one, from the grocery store. I ate a piece while sitting at my kitchen counter, 26 years old. No family that claims me, no parents who speak to me, no sister who will acknowledge me. And I'm fine with all of it, better than fine, because I'm not carrying their lies anymore. I'm not protecting their image anymore. I'm not pretending their version of events is reality anymore. They wanted to publicly disown me and present me with a bill for raising me. They wanted to humiliate me in front of 30 relatives. They got exactly what they set in motion. Every consequence they're facing came from their own choices. The money they stole, the lies they told, the son they decided to destroy at a birthday dinner. I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves, and I just made sure everyone could see it clearly. My phone hasn't rung in 3 days. The apartment is quiet, and I'm exactly where I planned to be from the moment I walked out of that dinner on my birthday. Free from them. Done with their manipulation. Done with being their disappointment. They threw me a birthday dinner to disown me. They succeeded, and now they get to live with what that actually costs.